Welcome back to my garden. Time for another video essay. During the week, amongst the deluge of email newsletters that I received, one of them began with an interesting quote from the late American social anthropologist Margaret Mead. Never doubt the power of a small group of thoughtful, committed people to change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Something like that. It's a wonderful quote, and in broad brushstrokes, I think I agree with her. In the newsletter, they spoke about how, in fact, research seems to back this up. That it only takes a few people to adopt seriously a novel idea for it to become part of our social practice. And the number is far fewer than you might think. Malcolm Gladwell's Tipping Point, he speaks about this, and it's I can't remember the percentage, maybe it's 10 or 20%. Nicholas Nassim Taleb, in one of his books, speaks about how it might be as little as 3 or 4. And they, in the case of Gladwell, examines this anecdotally. In the case of Taleb, he unpacks the maths behind it. But the reason this happens is because whilst there might be a few small, thoughtful, committed individuals out there seriously doing something, the vast majority of people, frankly, couldn't care less. And if you think of things that changed in my lifetime, for example, that new ideas that took hold, even though there might have been naysayers or people grumbling about it. Seatbelts in cars. Now, these weren't legally required until, I can't remember when, the 90s, I don't know. But now it's we just accept it. And you might say, but, well, obviously, why wouldn't you? It's a sensible thing to do. And indeed, the small group of committed advocates for seatbelts, not just in the front seat, but in the back seat as well, that was their argument. It saves lives. It makes sense. But there was pushback. People grumbled because for the manufacturers of cars, well, it was an added cost, obviously, that would be passed on to consumers. And for the consumers of those new cars, it was the added cost that they might have to pay, although not particularly significant. And of course, once it was legally required, the inconvenience of getting seatbelts fitted in their cars. But the truth was, those people didn't really care. They grumbled, but didn't care. And if you think about another, maybe more controversial issue, the idea of smoking, a small group of committed advocates, I suppose, shaped at the way we view smoking in social areas, in public areas, the way society views smoking. And yes, there was pushback. There was the obvious reason that suddenly something that people were very committed to doing, and indeed addicted, they would be forced to do in rather inconvenient ways. But, that kerfuffle has died down. However, when we think about what all these people, anthropologists, journalists, analysts, have been suggesting, that it takes far fewer people to make something significant happen than one might imagine. Let's just couch it in those terms. They often say this, talking about positive changes. And the problem comes when we have things that will be, in a sense, attracting commitment on both sides of the spectrum, on both extremes. And that's the difficulty of, for example, changing certain environmental laws. Because whilst the people with skin in the game, with big investment to sort of influence them, car manufacturers, they didn't really care. It wasn't really a big problem. But changing our attitudes towards deforestation, well, that is a significant problem, for example, here in Brazil, when you talk about the cattle industry. I mean, they have a lot invested in cutting down rainforests. So the people, the group of thoughtful, committed citizens are on both sides of the spectrum. Indian rights activists, environmental activists. Well, they are thoughtful and committed, but so are the land barons. Because make no mistake, they've thought about it a lot and they are very committed. Now, I might not agree with the moral position they're taking, but they don't agree with me. And, well, that's when a clash of ideas takes place. And we're seeing this sort of broadly across society. It's problematic. Now, at this point, you're perhaps wondering, but if you're a regular viewer or one of my pocket of committed, thoughtful subscribers, you might be saying, Neil, last week you were talking about, you had a moment of reflection, and you're talking about why we don't pursue things. What's the things that we want to, why we aren't doing what we really want to do. What's that got to do with this? And I think quite a lot. Because one of the reasons we, I suppose, abandon some of our dreams, it depends what that dream is. Or we don't pursue what our soul is driving us to. That sort of deep inner voice is telling us that we need to do something and we don't do it. Well, we don't do it because we feel either, in the case of perhaps less controversial activities, we feel that our voice alone will not be enough. That what we want to do will be, to coin that rather lovely graphic expression, will be pissing against the wind. A battle you're going to lose. And so we give up before we start. And if we're dealing with something, perhaps an idea, where we're going to come up against powerful vested interests, well, even if we do believe that a small number of people can make a difference, we on reflection, suspect that there is a larger group of people who will make a difference in the opposite direction. And so we simply don't start what we feel we should do. Now, it's not obvious what the way around this is, other than to say that I suspect, unless you're placed in the position of an enormous moral quandary that forces you to take profound and potentially hazardous action. And occasionally we come across these examples in movies. There's a movie with Meryl Streep, I think it is, fighting against perhaps it's a nuclear plant or some sort of enormous hazardous activity, or the Al Pacino, The Inside, I think that's what it's called, where he plays a whistleblower, the part of a whistleblower against the tobacco industry. And obviously, if you're someone in that sort of position where you're faced with a really profound moral quandary, what you have to do, you have to make a very difficult decision, one way or the other, and be aware that it will be a long, hard, perilous, perhaps even fatal road, depending on whom you're taking action against. But for many of us, well, that is not our circumstances, and what we feel called to do, that sort of inner voice. In my case, to make art in a place where, well, there's not terribly much of it, to make an argument for a sort of a more thoughtful, philosophical way of living, well, this runs at odds against really what society in general is doing. But I believe that for the most part, this broader society are more like the car industry than the tobacco industry. So people don't want to do certain things, but it's because it's an inconvenience. And the way to shift that sort of worldview is simply to do what I'm doing and to make small inroads where possible. And I think that's probably what happened in terms of making seatbelts happen. It was a series of very small steps that everyone was kind of happy with. But little by little, a huge change took place. And now, as I say, it's hard to imagine cars without seatbelts. They are a relic of times past. And perhaps that's how it will work in my sort of crusade for more contemplative art in this little village where I find myself. That after a time, people won't be able to imagine how there wasn't an art gallery, and schools won't be able to imagine how they didn't have visits to an art gallery. And it will be hard to imagine an education, certainly in primary schools, where children didn't draw a lot. And frankly, that doesn't happen right now. So that's the fight that I'm going to fight. And I think it's a question that we all need to sort of ask ourselves. If we're not doing something that we love doing, is it because we believe that taking that sort of action is futile? Now, probably this doesn't apply to the vast majority of dreams not followed. So, as I alluded to last week, this is going to be a series. I need to look at a vast array of reasons why we don't do what we want to do. The majority of those won't be some form of social activism. But perhaps for many of us, doing something that nourishes the soul and makes a contribution to our community, building communal gardens or, things like that. I think a lot of us would benefit, and we just don't take action because we feel small and alone. Now, I suppose what drew me to this type of theme is that starting tomorrow, we will have 4 days of carnival in Brazil, which means 4 days of social mayhem and, frankly, a lot of very annoying loud noise. I'm all in favour of parades and community coming together and the joy that might engender, but that's not what's going to happen here. But never mind. I will enjoy my garden and the birds. And that's about it for this week. So, as always, I'd love to know what you think. If this made sense, let me know in the comments below. And until next week, I trust your lives are filled with joy. And that's it from a, well, not very sunny actually, overcast Brazil.